Dawn came slow that morning, a pale light crawling across the fog-drenched fields. The air was thick, heavy, and cold. German tank crews could barely see 50 yards ahead. Somewhere in that mist, American forces were retreating, or so they thought. Engines rumbled in the gray. A formation of Panther tanks, their tracks grinding through the mud, moved cautiously toward the village of Aracourt. Their commanders were confident. After all, the Panther was the king of the battlefield. Thick armor, a high-velocity 75mm gun, unmatched at range. Every encounter with American armor before had ended the same way. Burning Shermans, smoking wrecks, and German superiority intact. But this morning, something was different. From a tree line half a mile away, an American lieutenant watched the German armor crawl forward. His name was Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Behind him, half buried in mist, sat 6 squat, low-slung machines, M18 Hellcats. They didn't look like much. Thin armor, open turret, lightweight frame. No one in their right mind would trade a Panther for one, but that wasn't the point. The Hellcat was designed for something no German engineer had ever considered: speed as a weapon. Where the Panther weighed 45 tons and crawled at 25 miles an hour, the M18 could hit 55 miles per hour on open ground. It was the fastest armored vehicle of the entire war, and on this battlefield, in the fog and confusion of Lorraine, that speed would become lethal. Leiper's men crouched in silence. The fog muffled everything, even the heartbeat of fear. Then, through the mist, a Panther emerged, black cross painted on its side, turret turning slowly, gun searching. Leiper whispered into the radio, "Hold fire, hold." The Panther advanced another 10 yards. Its gun traversed left, then finally it exposed its flank. Leiper gave the order, "Fire." The sound split the silence. A flash, a crack, and a white shockwave rolled through the air. The 76mm shell slammed into the Panther's side armor. A second later, flames burst through the hatch. A column of smoke twisting into the fog, the Hellcats reversed instantly, engines screaming, disappearing into the gray. When the Germans returned fire, they hit nothing but empty mist. Minutes later, the Americans reappeared from a different direction. Another shot, another Panther down. By the time the Germans realized what was happening, they weren't fighting tanks anymore. They were being hunted. Across the Aracourt sector, it was the same story. Light, fast, and fearless, the Hellcats moved in wolf packs, striking, vanishing, reappearing miles away. The Germans couldn't comprehend it. They believed the Americans had more tanks than they actually did. In reality, just 3 battalions of Hellcats were tearing through an entire Panzer brigade. One German commander, writing in his after-action report, put it simply, "They moved like ghosts. We fired where they were. They were already gone." The key was doctrine. The Americans didn't meet strength with strength. They used speed, coordination, and flexibility. Each Hellcat unit worked in perfect sync with infantry and artillery, striking fast, communicating constantly, and never staying still long enough to be hit. As the fog lifted, the full picture of the battle came into focus. 20 German tanks burned on the plain. The Americans had lost only a handful. When the smoke cleared, even the survivors of the Panzer divisions admitted they'd never seen anything like it. The M18 wasn't supposed to win gunfights. It wasn't supposed to survive a hit. But that morning, it changed the balance of power in Europe. Because for the first time, the Germans weren't facing a machine that tried to match their armor. They were facing one that outthought it. The M18 Hellcat wasn't born from brute strength. It was born from a radical idea that victory didn't always belong to the thickest armor or the biggest gun. Sometimes it belonged to the one that refused to stand still. As the sun broke through the fog, the men of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion watched the battlefield glow orange with fire. The Panthers lay silent hulks of twisted steel. The Americans were already gone, moving to their next ambush point, engines roaring, dust trailing behind. They were ghosts again, and in the shattered calm of that September morning, one German officer muttered under his breath, "They fight like the wind." He wasn't wrong. The M18 Hellcat didn't just outrun the Panzers. It outran everything the Germans thought they understood about war. Aberdeen, Proving Ground, Maryland. The war was raging overseas, but here, on a field of mud and steel, a different kind of battle was being fought. Not against the enemy, but against old ideas. Rows of prototypes stood silent under the gray American sky. Engineers in oil-stained overalls moved between them, clipboards in hand, debating, arguing, drawing lines in the dirt with their boots. At the center of it all was a man who didn't believe armor won wars. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce. Bruce had seen what happened when tanks moved too slow, when armor tried to fight armor head-on. He'd studied the carnage of France in 1940, when German Panzers rolled through the Maginot Line and left behind a generation of rusting French steel. He understood what the world hadn't yet learned. Speed kills. So he fought for a new doctrine, one the Army didn't want to hear. He proposed a separate force, fast, mobile, aggressive, designed not to defend but to hunt. He called them tank destroyers. At first, the generals laughed. America's armored forces were still obsessed with big guns and thick armor. They wanted another Sherman, not a stripped-down racer. Bruce didn't care. He knew the Germans were perfecting monsters. Tigers, Panthers, elephants, and the U.S. couldn't win that race. So he decided to change the rules. He took inspiration from cavalry tactics, hit and fade, move and strike. He imagined a vehicle that could appear, fire and disappear before the enemy even adjusted his sights. Armor would be light. Speed would be everything. That dream became reality in the hands of the Buick Division of General Motors. In 1943, their prototype rolled out of the factory floor, long, low, and deadly fast. It was the M18 Hellcat. At first glance, it looked fragile, almost reckless. Its armor was barely enough to stop rifle fire. Its open-top turret left crews exposed to rain, shrapnel, even sniper rounds. But under the hood, it carried a secret weapon, a Continental R975 radial engine. The same power plant used in aircraft. The result? A tank destroyer that could hit 55 miles an hour on roads and 45 across fields. It could change direction faster than most cars, and it could outmaneuver anything on treads. When the Army tested it, officers didn't believe the readings. One shouted over the roar of the engine, "It's not a tank, it's a damn race car." They weren't wrong. Buick's engineers had stripped every unnecessary ounce from the frame. No extra plating, no excess weight. Every bolt and curve was designed for speed and agility. And then came the turret, fully rotating, armed with the 76mm M1 gun. It wasn't the biggest cannon in the war, but with high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, it could punch through the sides of a Panther or Tiger if it struck first. That was the philosophy. First shot, first kill. The soldiers who trained on it were skeptical at first. No roof, no protection, no chance, they thought. But the first time they drove it, that doubt vanished. In maneuvers across Louisiana, the Hellcats stunned observers, circling around Shermans, outpacing jeeps and engaging mock targets with hit-and-run precision. It didn't fight like a tank. It danced. Bruce watched the demonstrations with quiet pride. He knew he'd built something that would change battlefields forever. A weapon that didn't rely on brute strength but on human instinct, timing, awareness, and the courage to move when others froze. When the first production models were shipped to Europe, the doctrine followed with them. Tank destroyer battalions, independent, mobile. Their creed was simple: seek, strike, destroy. In the coming year, those words would echo across France and Germany. because once the Hellcats reached the front, everything about armored warfare would change. The Germans had built fortresses on tracks. The Americans had built Predators, and while the Panzers lumbered across Europe with thick armor and heavy guns, the Hellcats would stalk them through fog and forest. Too fast to be hit, too lethal to ignore. By the time they reached the fields of Lorraine, the soldiers knew exactly what they had. Not a tank, a hunter. And when those hunters met the pride of the German Panzer divisions, the world would finally understand what Bruce had known all along. That speed, when wielded with skill, was deadlier than steel. September 19, 1944, near Aricourt, France. The fog rolled in like smoke from an invisible fire. By dawn, the world had vanished. Fields, trees, even the horizon swallowed by a ghostly haze. Engines idled in the mist, their low growl echoing through the valleys of Lorraine. Somewhere ahead, the German army was moving. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion sat in silence, waiting. Their orders were simple. Hold the line, protect the flank of Patton's Third Army, but nothing about what was coming would be simple. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper checked his watch. His crew inside the M18 Hellcat waited with him, huddled in the open turret, breath steaming in the morning air. They'd fought before, Sicily, Normandy, but this felt different. This wasn't defense, this was ambush. The radio crackled. A forward observer whispered the words they'd been waiting for. Enemy armor approaching, looks like Panthers. Everyone froze. The Panthers were the most feared tanks on the continent. Thick armor, long-barreled 75mm guns, and the confidence of superiority. For months, the Germans had crushed anything in their path, but this time they weren't facing Shermans. They were facing Hellcats. Leiper raised his binoculars. Through the fog, shadows moved, hulking silhouettes advancing slowly across the plain. The German formation was tight, deliberate, unaware that eyes were already on them. He whispered into the radio, voice low and calm. Guns loaded. Wait for the flank. The Hellcats crouched in a tree line, their thin armor glistening with dew. Each crew had rehearsed this 100 times. Hit, move, hide. If they stayed still, they were dead. The first Panther crossed the open field. Its turret turned slightly left, exposing its side. Leiper didn't hesitate. Fire! The Hellcat's gun roared. The recoil slammed through the frame, and a second later, the Panther erupted. Flames shooting through the hatch, smoke curling into the fog. Move! Move! The Hellcat reversed at full throttle, treads clawing at the mud. German guns fired blindly into the haze, missing by meters. Before they could adjust, the Americans reappeared. Not from the same direction, but from the right flank. Another flash, another kill. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a hunt. The 704th fought like predators, using the terrain as cover, darting between hedgerows and ridgelines. Their open turrets gave them visibility the Germans didn't have, a 360-degree view of the chaos. Each crew moved with terrifying coordination. They didn't wait for orders. They acted instinctively, trusting their speed to keep them alive. The Germans tried to respond with their usual doctrine, halt, form a line, return fire, but the fog made it useless. Panthers were turning in circles, firing at ghosts. By the time they reoriented, the Hellcats had already vanished again. Captain James Leach, commanding another platoon nearby, described it later. They thought they were chasing tanks. They were chasing thunder. By midday, the battle had stretched across miles of farmland. The Germans kept pushing reinforcements forward, convinced they were facing an armored division. In reality, fewer than 30 Hellcats were holding the entire front. American artillery joined in, guided by Hellcat radio calls. Each shell landed closer, turning the fog into a wall of smoke and dust. One Panther tried to charge straight through, its gun blazing. A Hellcat cut across its path at full speed, fired on the move, and hit it square in the turret ring. The explosion lit the field like lightning. The Panther stopped dead. Its commander never got out. By evening, the plain of Aracourt was littered with burning wrecks, twisted steel, black smoke rising into the fading light. The Germans had lost more than 60 tanks. The Americans, just a handful of vehicles and men. When the last gun fell silent, the crews finally looked at what they'd done. They were exhausted, soaked in mud and sweat, faces blackened by powder, but the disbelief was the same for all of them. They'd beaten the best armor in the world, not by brute force, but by speed, nerve, and precision. Word spread fast through Patton's command. The 704th had stopped an entire Panzer brigade. Their victory became a legend overnight. But there was no celebration, only the sound of engines cooling and men cleaning guns. Because they knew this was only the beginning. The Germans would come again, heavier, angrier, determined to crush the fast American machines. What they didn't understand was that the Hellcat crews didn't fear them anymore. They'd seen what speed could do, and they knew. If they moved first, they'd live to fight again. As night fell, Leiper climbed onto his Hellcat's hull, looking out across the smoke and silence. Somewhere in the dark, another Panther burned. Its crew gone, its gun still pointed toward the enemy that had outpaced it. Leiper lit a cigarette, the glow flickering in the wind. He didn't smile. He just whispered, "Let them come." Because by then, everyone in the 704th understood the truth. The M18 Hellcat wasn't just a machine. It was a new kind of warfare, fast, ruthless, and unstoppable. September 20th, 1944, near Château-Salins, Lorraine. The fog had lifted, but the battlefield was still a ruin of smoke and wreckage. Burned Panthers dotted the ridgelines, blackened and still. The smell of oil and cordite hung in the air. The Germans were regrouping. The 11th Panzer Division, veterans of Russia, had been thrown into the line to break the American flank. Their commander believed the chaos of the last day was a fluke, that once visibility returned, discipline and armor would restore the old order. They were wrong. By mid-morning, the sound of engines rolled across the fields again. But this time, the Americans weren't hiding in the fog. They were hunting in daylight. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion advanced in pairs, moving fast along the hedgerows. Each M18 Hellcat carried only an inch of armor on its sides, but the crews trusted their speed more than any plate of steel. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper's platoon led the column. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and running on black coffee and adrenaline. But morale was high. The men had seen the impossible. Panthers burning, tigers abandoned. And they knew the secret now. Strike first, move faster, never stop. Ahead, reconnaissance reported German armor massing beyond a small village. The Hellcats moved to intercept. The sun was low, the ground wet, and the open fields gave them no cover. Still, they went. Leiper radioed the formation. Wolf pack pattern. We hit, relocate, and hit again. The M18 split wide, engines roaring as they crossed the ridge. The Germans spotted them almost instantly. Panthers opened fire, long-range shots, precise and deadly. The first shell screamed past, digging into the mud behind the lead Hellcat. The second landed closer, showering the crew with dirt. But the Americans didn't slow down. At 50 miles an hour, they darted across the field like racing cars, firing on the move. Their 76mm guns flashed. The first round hit a Panther's in-pan armor. The second ripped into its engine deck. Flames erupted, smoke curling into the sky. The Hellcats kept circling, using the terrain to mask their movement. One darted behind a barn, reversed out another side, and fired again. The Germans struggled to track them. By the time a gunner aimed, his target was gone. Radio chatter filled the air. 2 Panthers burning on the left. Reloading! Keep them guessing. For every German tank destroyed, the Americans changed position, their engines screaming. exhaust pouring black. Then came the counterfire. A Tiger I rolled onto the ridge, its 88mm gun booming. The shells struck a Hellcat head-on. The thin armor disintegrated. The crew didn't survive. But before the Tiger could reload, 3 M18s appeared from different angles. One round hit its track, another pierced the rear plate. The Tiger erupted, a column of fire 20 feet high. Leiper exhaled through the smoke. "Keep moving," he said quietly. By dusk, the battlefield was chaos. German formations broke apart under the constant hit-and-run attacks. Commanders reported radio silence, confusion, and units firing at shadows. When the fighting stopped, the 704th Battalion had destroyed more than 30 enemy tanks and vehicles. They'd done it with machines that weighed half as much, carried half the armor, and could be repaired with spare parts from a truck depot. The Germans had never seen tactics like it. Their doctrine depended on strength and formation, on knowing where the enemy stood. But the Hellcats refused to stand anywhere for long. A German officer later described it in his report. "They moved like cavalry, but struck like artillery. We could not catch them. We could not predict them." That was the essence of the Hellcat. It wasn't built to hold ground. It was built to disrupt, to tear through the enemy's rhythm, to make them fight in panic instead of control. As night fell, the surviving crews parked their Hellcats under a line of trees. They checked for leaks, cleaned the guns, and lit cigarettes under the quiet rumble of cooling engines. The open-topped turrets left them exposed to the cold night air. Some men tied canvas over the top. Others didn't bother. They knew they'd done something extraordinary. They'd turned speed into survival, and survival into victory. But they also knew something else. For every Panther they'd burned today, more were coming. The Germans were learning. Soon the fog would return, the weather would worsen, and the ground would freeze. And when it did, speed alone might not be enough. Still, as the night deepened, the men of the 704th slept beside their machines. Their hands still black with oil and powder, their dreams filled with the thunder of engines. Because for now they had proven a truth no one in Berlin wanted to believe. The lightest armor in Europe had just defeated the heaviest. October 1944, the Lorraine front. The rains had come early. The ground was soft and the smell of fuel and decay clung to the air. Across miles of churned farmland, wrecked Panthers and Tigers lay half buried in the mud. Their turrets blown off, tracks twisted, hulls cooling in the drizzle. The myth of the German Panzer was dying, but few understood it yet. From a distance, it looked like another victory for the Americans, another German counterattack broken on the fields of France. But what had really happened in Lorraine went deeper than tactics or luck. It was the moment two military philosophies collided, and one of them shattered. For years, the Germans had built their war machine on a single idea: superiority through engineering. Every tank was a masterpiece, complex, heavy, deadly. The Panther's 75mm gun could destroy anything it faced. The Tiger's armor could shrug off all but the heaviest shells. But both shared the same flaw. They were too perfect for war. Each tank took months to build, thousands of man-hours and tons of rare materials. They broke down often, consumed fuel like locomotives, and required trains just to move them to the front. In contrast, American factories built tanks and destroyers like cars, simple, fast, and replaceable. The M18 Hellcat embodied that philosophy completely. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't pretty, but it worked, and it worked everywhere. At the Buick plant in Flint, Michigan, the assembly lines ran day and night. Each Hellcat rolled out in less than 2 days. The same workers who built family cars now built the fastest tank destroyer in the world. And when one was lost in combat, it didn't cripple the army. Another was already waiting on the docks. That was the difference. Germany had the finest tanks in the world. America had the means to replace every loss before the smoke cleared. But mass production alone didn't win Lorraine. Doctrine did. The Tank Destroyer Command had been ridiculed when it formed. Critics said lightly armored, open-topped vehicles would never survive real battle. They were right about one thing: the Hellcat couldn't take a hit, but it didn't have to. The doctrine was built on mobility and intelligence, coordinated strikes using speed, radio communication, and terrain awareness. Every Hellcat was part of a larger organism. Infantry spotting from hedgerows, artillery zeroing in from miles away, and air reconnaissance guiding from above. The Germans still fought like it was 1941. Formations, armor columns, and radio silence. The Americans fought like it was 1945, fast, networked, improvisational. During the Lorraine campaign, that difference became fatal. While German units waited for orders that never came, Hellcat crews were already moving, adapting, flanking. They didn't need permission to act, only opportunity. When fuel shortages crippled the German advance, the Hellcats kept moving, powered by American logistics that seemed endless. When weather grounded the Luftwaffe, American supply convoys rolled through the mud, bringing ammunition and food to the front. Every advantage the Germans once held, surprise, armor, precision, was gone. By the time the fighting in Lorraine ended, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed over 80 enemy tanks and vehicles. Their losses were minimal, but their achievement wasn't just measured in kills, it was in transformation. The Hellcat had proven that the future of warfare wasn't heavy or slow. It was fast, flexible, and expendable. Patton himself praised the destroyer crews for their discipline and courage. He understood the value of momentum, the same principle that drove every Hellcat assault. He called them the eyes and claws of the Third Army. But even as the front moved east, the men knew the war wasn't done. They could feel it in the cold wind that swept over Lorraine. Germany was falling back, but it was far from broken, and winter was coming, bringing with it the forests of the Ardennes, the snow, and the desperate fury of an enemy that refused to die quietly. The Hellcats would soon face their hardest test, not in open fields, but in frozen forests where movement slowed and every advantage of speed vanished. For now, though, the lesson of Lorraine was clear. The invincible German armor had been outpaced, outnumbered, and outthought. The myth of the unstoppable Panzer was over. The future belonged to the fast. And for the men of the 704th, there was no turning back. They'd rewritten the rules of armored combat and proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing on a battlefield wasn't the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It was the one that moved first. In the days that followed, Lorraine became a graveyard of steel. The once green fields were now scattered with burned-out tanks, twisted hulls, and the smell of diesel hanging heavy in the rain. German commanders refused to believe what they were seeing. Dozens of Panthers and Tigers destroyed by a handful of light, fast vehicles the Americans barely considered tanks. It wasn't luck, it was doctrine. For years, the German army had trusted its armor. Precision-built, mechanically perfect, designed to dominate through sheer strength. Every Panther was a masterpiece of engineering, every Tiger a monument to overconfidence. They were powerful, but they were also fragile, overcomplicated, expensive, slow to build, and constantly breaking down. The Americans had taken a different path. They didn't build machines to last forever. They built machines to win now. The M18 Hellcat was a perfect example of that philosophy, a weapon that traded protection for agility and complexity for reliability. In factories across the United States, assembly lines at Buick and General Motors churned out Hellcats faster than the Germans could repair their tanks. Each one took less than 2 days to build. The same hands that had once built cars for peacetime now built speed for war. The Germans built tanks like craftsmen. The Americans built them like mechanics. It was a quiet revolution, not just in production, but in how wars were fought. For the first time, speed, communication, and adaptability mattered more than weight and armor. That difference became brutally clear in Lorraine. German units tried to counterattack with the same rigid tactics that had worked in 1940. Tight formations, deliberate movements, and radio silence. The Hellcat battalions fought like something else entirely. A network of hunters, fast-moving and connected, always feeding information back through radios and forward observers. Each platoon acted independently. Each decision happened in seconds, not hours. When one Hellcat found the enemy, the others were already moving to flank. While the Germans waited for orders, the Americans were already firing. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion's success wasn't just measured in enemy tanks destroyed. It was in how it forced the enemy to change. German tank commanders started hesitating before every move, checking their flanks, wasting precious time. For the first time since the Blitz, the hunters had become the hunted. But there was another truth behind the victories. The Hellcat was fast, yes, but it was fragile. Its open turret left crews exposed to artillery and shrapnel. Its thin armor could be pierced by almost anything heavier than a machine gun. And every man inside knew it. Survival depended on instinct, reacting faster, thinking ahead, never staying still. The men joked that their best armor was the accelerator pedal. They weren't far from wrong. Even so, morale was high. After years of facing German tanks with fear, the Americans had finally found something that turned the fight around. Speed had become confidence, and confidence had become control. The higher command took notice. Reports from Lorraine spread quickly through SHAEF and Patton's Third Army. The M18's performance was analyzed, tested, praised. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of American ingenuity, a proof that mobility could outfight might. But even as the front pushed east, danger was far from over. The Germans were retreating but not broken. Fuel shortages, logistics, and overstretched lines plagued both sides. And as autumn turned to winter, a new storm gathered in the Ardennes. There, among the frozen forests and narrow roads, the Hellcats would face something far worse than fog or distance. They would face a resurgent enemy determined to make one final stand, and in terrain where speed could no longer save them. The men didn't know it yet, but their greatest test was waiting in the snow. The Battle of the Bulge was coming, and for the first time, the Hellcat's greatest strength would become its greatest weakness. Because in the cold of the Ardennes, there was no room to run. The Ardennes, December 1944. Snow drifted over the trees, muffling the sound of engines and boots. The forest looked still, almost peaceful. But beneath that silence, an army was moving. Hitler had gambled everything on one last strike, a surprise counterattack through Belgium and Luxembourg, aimed at splitting the Allied front and retaking Antwerp. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle the U.S. Army would ever fight. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was there, spread thin across the line, their Hellcats buried under blankets of snow and ice. The speed that had made them untouchable in France was now trapped by winter. Engines froze. Tracks seized in the cold. The forest turned every road into a choke point, every movement into a risk. The Germans came through the mist again. Panthers, Tigers, even the massive King Tigers. Their guns flared in the snow, lighting up the woods like lightning strikes. This time, there was no open terrain, no chance to circle and flank. The Hellcats had to fight head-on. In those first days, it was chaos. American lines buckled under the surprise. Columns were cut off, units overrun, and roads filled with burning wrecks. The Hellcat crews fought from behind trees, from ditches, from the ruins of small Belgian towns, anything that could hide them long enough to fire. At Noville, a platoon of Hellcats took position behind a stone wall overlooking a narrow road. Through the snow, they saw the silhouettes of German armor advancing, dark shapes, slow and confident. The lead Panther rolled into view. The first Hellcat fired. The shell bounced off the front plate, sparking harmlessly. They shifted position, aiming for the side. The next round found its mark. The Panther erupted, flames licking through the snow. The Germans returned fire instantly, shells crashing into the wall, tearing it apart. The Hellcats reversed, slipping on the ice, smoke curling from their engines. One was hit, then another, but they kept firing until the last machine could move. When it was over, 4 Panthers burned in the snow, and the Americans had vanished again into the trees. Every mile of that winter advance was bought the same way, with improvisation, desperation, and speed used in fragments, not bursts. The men learned to keep engines running through the night so the oil wouldn't freeze. They wrapped themselves in blankets and canvas to sleep inside the turrets, rifles beside them, ready for another attack before dawn. What saved them wasn't armor or even the gun. It was discipline, the same instinct that had carried them through Lorraine. Move, fire, relocate, survive. By January, the German offensive began to crumble. Fuel shortages, American artillery, and relentless counterattacks had turned their momentum into exhaustion. When Patton's Third Army broke through from the south, the 704th was among the first to push forward again, engines roaring through snow and wreckage. The Hellcats reclaimed lost ground mile by mile. Their speed returned with the thaw, and by February, they were back to doing what they did best, cutting off retreating columns, ambushing convoys, hitting fast and hard. When they crossed the Moselle and pushed toward the Rhine, German armor was in full retreat. The Panthers were abandoned in fields, their crews out of fuel, their engines frozen, and in their place came the sound that had haunted them since Lorraine, the deep growl of radial engines closing in. The war was almost over. By the spring of 1945, the Hellcats rolled into Germany itself. The 704th fought their last major actions near the Rhine crossings, clearing pockets of resistance, supporting infantry, and silencing the remnants of the Wehrmacht's once mighty Panzer divisions. When the guns finally went silent, the men of the 704th looked back at what they had done, from the fog of Lorraine to the snow of the Ardennes to the ruins of the Reich itself. They had fought in machines that shouldn't have survived, against tanks that should have destroyed them, but they'd turned speed, instinct, and courage into a weapon the enemy couldn't counter. After the war, the M18 Hellcat quietly disappeared from service. New tanks replaced it, heavier, more powerful, built for a new kind of world. But its legacy remained, not in steel, but in philosophy. The Hellcat had proved that mobility could defeat might, that doctrine and coordination could do what raw firepower couldn't. It showed that in war, victory didn't belong to the biggest gun or the thickest armor, but to the one who thought faster, moved first, and refused to stand still. Decades later, veterans would still talk about it with the same quiet pride. The speed, the sound, the feeling of moving faster than fear itself. And somewhere in an old photo album, the caption beneath a black and white picture of a crew leaning against their battered machine still says it best. You could hit it all day, and if you missed the heart, it was gone before your next shot. The Germans never expected the M18 Hellcat to outrun their Panzers, but it did. And in doing so, it outran everything they believed about war.